The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass, casting their pale wash across the auditorium of Lincoln High School in San Diego. Sarah Chen sat in the third row, her county general scrub still damp from the night shift, the smell of antiseptic clinging to the fabric like a second skin, underneath it the metallic tang of blood she'd scrubbed from her forearms at 5:06 a.m. The ceremony wouldn't start for another 8 minutes. Around her, parents in pressed blazers and tailored dresses turned to admire each other's children's programs. None of them looked like they'd just spent 12 hours trying to keep a 73-year-old septic patient alive. None of them moved like they were still listening for alarm bells. She adjusted the jacket draped over her lap, a faded navy thing, older than her son Michael, its lining worn soft in places. Inside that lining, stitched tight against the fabric where no one would think to look, was a unit patch from SEAL Team 3. The edges had frayed from 18 years of wear, from being sewn and resewn, from being touched in moments when her hands needed to remember what they were made for. She kept her fingers on it now, the texture rough under her thumbnail. A habit. An anchor. The auditorium filled with the shuffling of feet and the whisper-quiet conversations of people who had slept through the night. A woman 2 seats over leaned toward her husband and laughed, a bright, uncomplicated sound. Sarah had forgotten what that sounded like. She'd forgotten a lot of things. Mostly deliberately. Michael would walk across that stage in 42 minutes. Michael, who she had raised alone after his father didn't come home from Marja. Michael, who didn't know his mother had been written out of the official record. Michael, who thought she was just a nurse. The thought settled in her chest like a stone in still water, heavy, undisturbed, exactly where it had been for years. She noticed the bulletin board in the hallway before she sat down. Military Scholarship Fund, the placard read in letters that had once been gold but had faded to the color of weak tea. 6 names listed. Michael's was not among them. She had submitted the paperwork herself 3 weeks ago. She had verified his father's records, his death certificate from the operations in Afghanistan. She had attached every document required. And still, no Michael. In the week since then, she had sat in the VA hospital waiting room, not as a caregiver this time, but as a patient, for an appointment to address the chronic pain in her shoulder, pain that had no diagnosis code because the injury that caused it had never officially happened. While she waited, surrounded by veterans in various states of exhaustion and acceptance, she had pulled up the scholarship fund's tax documents on her phone. The numbers didn't align. $340,000 in donations over the past 5 years. Only $180,000 distributed to families. The rest funneled into a consulting account she didn't recognize. Harbor Solutions LLC. The name meant nothing. The missing money meant everything. The program trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear. From restraint. From the particular kind of stillness that comes when you're holding yourself in place with nothing but discipline and the memory of what you were trained to do. A man in a charcoal suit appeared at the top of the auditorium steps, moving with the kind of deliberate confidence that came from knowing everyone in the room either wanted something from you or had already given it. Principal Vernon Caldwell. He smiled at parents as he passed, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He shook hands with the superintendent. He adjusted the microphone. He was exactly the kind of man Sarah had learned to read in 30 seconds, the kind who confused compliance with respect, who believed his position was a product of merit rather than the right phone call at the right moment. She watched him greet the incoming graduates as they lined up in the hallway beyond the auditorium doors. He placed his hand on a girl's shoulder, said something that made her laugh. He reminded her of doctors she'd worked with, the kind who had been trained to project competence and had never questioned whether they actually possessed it. The graduates began their processional. Pomp and circumstance swelled through the auditorium. Sarah stood with the other parents, the program held against her chest. Her eyes found Michael immediately, tall, steady, moving down the center aisle in his cap and gown, looking exactly like his father had at this age. Looking like someone whose entire life was still ahead of him, unmarked by the kinds of choices that couldn't be undone. Caldwell took the microphone again. His voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had given this speech before, would give it again, had perfected the art of sounding genuine. These young people represent our community's best and brightest. We celebrate not just their academic achievements, but the character they've demonstrated through service. Service. The word hung in the air like something false, something polished. Sarah watched Caldwell's jaw move around it, watched how easily it rolled from his tongue. She thought of the missing $160,000. She thought of families who had applied for that scholarship and been turned down, families with one parent, families trying to keep their children's educations alive while managing the wreckage of military loss. She thought of Michael's father, whose name appeared nowhere in the official records anymore, whose sacrifice had been catalogued and filed and erased the same way she had been erased. The ceremony continued. Caldwell spoke about Lincoln High's excellence. The orchestra played. Parents held up phones to record moments they would never quite relive the same way they were experiencing them now. And Sarah sat with her hands flat on the program, her shoulder burning with old pain, her heart moving through the measured rhythm she had learned when she was someone else entirely. Around her, a woman in the row behind leaned forward to her companion. "That's Vernon Caldwell. He's been principal here for 8 years. The school's transformed under him. Graduation rate up, test scores up. He's raising funds for scholarships now too. My daughter's friend got one. Paid almost everything." Sarah didn't turn. She didn't move. She simply noted the information the way she had been taught, carefully, completely, with the understanding that details were currency in the kind of work she used to do. Used to. Past tense. That was the deal. That was the erasure. That was the price of having been someone else. But the numbers in the tax documents remained in her head, precise and unreconciled, the way numbers had a way of doing when you were trained to notice what didn't add up. $432,000 in donations since Caldwell had taken over. $219,000 distributed. $213,000 in the consulting account. Harbor Solutions LLC. She had pulled up the registered agent. Vernon Caldwell's address. Michael would reach the stage in 9 minutes. Caldwell would hand him his diploma and shake his hand and smile that practiced smile. And Sarah would sit in this auditorium, wearing scrubs that still smelled like the last patient she couldn't save, with a faded unit patch stitched inside her jacket and a list of discrepancies in a scholarship fund that was supposed to honor the families that military service had broken. She kept her eyes on Michael. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system breathing, the subtle wheeze of air being pushed through ducts, the fluorescent lights humming their electric lullaby. And in that quiet, Sarah's hands moved of their own accord, one index finger tracing the edge of the program, the other pressing gently against the faded unit patch through the jacket lining, the touch barely perceptible but everything to her. The program trembled slightly in Sarah's hands as she lowered it to her lap. The auditorium was already 3/4 full, families settling into the folding chairs with the particular restlessness of people marking time before something official began. She'd made it. Found a seat in the back row, tucked herself into the corner where the crowd wouldn't notice scrub pants under a borrowed jacket. Michael would walk across that stage in 43 minutes. She could last 43 minutes. A shadow fell across her row. "Excuse me." The voice belonged to Principal Vernon Caldwell, his smile the kind that required active maintenance, like a machine kept running only through constant effort. He was 52, silver spring hair, the kind of tan that came from weekends on a boat. His suit probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. "I'm sorry, but we have a dress code for guests." Sarah looked down at her scrubs. The hem of her pants was visible beneath the jacket. There was a coffee stain on her left sleeve she'd missed that morning at 2:30 a.m., right after she'd finished the code on a stabbing victim at Oak Creek Memorial, right after she'd talked his family through the fact that his aorta had been severed and there was nothing anyone could do. "I came directly from work," she said. "I'm sorry. I didn't have time to change." "That's not really acceptable." Caldwell's smile didn't waver. He was a man who'd spent his entire career understanding the exact temperature at which courtesy becomes a weapon. "We have standards. I'm sure you understand. I'm going to need you to leave." Sarah's breath came level. 1, 2, 3. She'd learned this in places where the wrong breath at the wrong moment meant everyone died.
I just need to watch my son's graduation.
And I respect that, I really do. But those are the rules. He straightened, preparing his exit. Security can show you to the parking lot. He didn't wait for her response. He simply turned and raised his hand, a small gesture of summoning, and within 15 seconds a security guard in a khaki uniform appeared at Sarah's row, his expression apologetic but immovable. He was young, maybe 24, the kind of young that made Sarah tired. He'd never had to make a decision where someone died regardless of which choice he made. If you could come with me. Not unkind. Not kind either. She stood. Gathered her program. The people in nearby seats had already begun to stare, that particular quality of attention that descends on public embarrassment like flies on meat. 2 rows back, a woman in a navy dress whispered something to her husband. A man in the 3rd row from the stage actually pulled out his phone. The walk to the exit felt longer than it should have. The gymnasium auditorium at Lincoln High School had been renovated 2 years ago, and the exits were at the far corners, requiring her to walk the entire length of the center aisle with 300 people watching. Her shoulders remained level. Her pace didn't accelerate. But internally, she was cataloging angles and exits and possible threats the way she always did, the way you couldn't stop doing after Marja, after the classified operation whose name she'd been ordered to forget, after the Pentagon decided that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen no longer officially existed. The guard's hand hovered near her elbow, not quite touching. Professional. They were 20 feet from the door when Caldwell's voice crackled through the auditorium's sound system, the microphone feedback creating a small shriek that made half the audience flinch. I apologize for the interruption, he said, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone performing concern for an audience. We all deeply appreciate the service of our healthcare workers, nurses especially do vital work in our communities. However, we've established dress codes for this ceremony to maintain the dignity and decorum of this occasion. Rules, as I always say, apply to everyone equally. He paused. The silence had weight. Security is simply helping to reinforce those standards. I'm sure everyone understands. A few people nodded. Most just stared. The disruptive individual will now be escorted from the premises. There it was. The words that turned a quietly awkward moment into a scene. Disruptive individual. As if she'd been the one making demands. As if she'd been the one wielding rules like weapons. Sarah stopped walking. The guard stopped with her, confused. She turned back toward the stage. Found Caldwell in the lights. Let her eyes find his and stay there. A single tear had escaped her left eye, not from shame, but from the sheer effort of not moving, not speaking, not doing the things her hands knew how to do to people who misused authority. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that only the people in the nearest seats could hear it. But it carried the weight of someone who had held dying men together with her hands while mortars fell around her. My son will understand that I tried to be here. Then she turned and walked to the exit. The guard hurried ahead to hold the door open. The auditorium was so silent you could hear the electronic hum of the amplifier system, that baseline electrical drone that never quite stopped. The doors closed behind her. Outside, the San Diego evening air hit her skin. 72 degrees. The parking lot smelled like asphalt heating down after a warm day, that particular acrid smell of concrete releasing the sun-stored energy. Her car was 15 spots away, a 2009 Honda Civic the color of old milk. She leaned against it and stared back at the auditorium's glass doors, watching the silhouettes of graduating students beginning to line up in the hallway beyond. Inside her jacket pocket, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Dr. Caldwell has filed a formal trespassing complaint. Effective immediately, you are barred from school property. Violation will result in arrest. Her phone number. How did he have her phone number? She'd find out later. She'd sit in her apartment at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, and piece together the timeline. The private investigator Caldwell had hired 12 days ago, the background check that had revealed nothing but a 7-year gap in her employment records that she couldn't explain without explaining where she'd actually been, the black sites and the classified operations and the part of her life that the Pentagon had ordered to vanish. The calls he'd made to the superintendent, to the school board members who owed him favors. The false complaint filed with the San Diego Police Department. All of it constructed with the methodical precision of a man who understood institutional power the way Sarah understood emergency medicine, intimately, with a kind of knowledge that came from years of practice. But right now, standing in the parking lot while her son's name was being called somewhere inside that building, she didn't know any of that yet. Right now, she just knew that she'd been erased twice, once by the Pentagon, once by a man in a suit who decided her presence threatened something. She didn't know what that something was. Not yet. The graduation music started. Pomp and circumstance, the same song played at 1,000 ceremonies, the same processional that had accompanied soldiers into auditoriums after operations she couldn't name, men with missing pieces and invisible wounds and the kind of damage that didn't show on X-rays. Her son was walking across that stage. And she was standing in a parking lot, still wearing scrubs beneath a borrowed jacket, waiting for a security guard who'd already forgotten her name to drive past and make sure she was actually leaving. She got in her car. Started the engine. And that's when the real nightmare began. The engine died. The parking lot was empty except for her car and the muffled sound of the auditorium behind those heavy doors. Sarah sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel, listening through the walls as Principal Caldwell's voice echoed across the speakers, announcing names. Diploma after diploma. Families cheering. And then, Michael Chen. Her son's name hung in the air like a question she couldn't answer. He walked across that stage alone. No mother in the audience. No one to see him except what he'd earned. Sarah could picture it exactly, the way he'd move, the way his eyes would scan the crowd for her face, that moment when he'd realize she wasn't there. The scrub she'd worn from the hospital suddenly felt less like dedication and more like a choice that had consequences. She'd gambled that showing up in her work clothes was better than not showing up at all. She'd lost that bet. The stage lights. The photographer's flash. The applause. All of it happening 12 feet away through concrete and steel and her own terrible judgment. Sarah's hands released the steering wheel. She leaned back against the seat and stared at the auditorium doors, those heavy metal things that had closed on her like a verdict. 18 years as a Navy SEAL, 3 classified tours through Marja, for wounded operators she'd dragged through a minefield while bleeding from shrapnel wounds, and what did it matter? What did any of it matter? The medals were locked in a safe deposit box she couldn't claim. The citations were buried in classified files. The promotions existed only in redacted paperwork that would never see daylight. And now she couldn't even sit in an audience and watch her son graduate because she was still wearing the scrubs from a shift that had run past midnight. The sacrifices she'd made, the missions, the silence, the complete erasure of Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen from every official record, suddenly felt like they'd cost her everything that actually mattered. She'd traded her identity for her country's security. And now she couldn't even keep the one identity she'd earned through 18 years of blood and protocol and midnight phone calls from people who didn't exist. 1 week earlier, Sarah had been sitting in the VA hospital waiting room at 2:13 in the afternoon. Waiting room number 4, the one with the broken water fountain and the fluorescent fixture that buzzed like it was dying. She'd been there as a patient, not a nurse, a distinction that made her feel like she was wearing someone else's skin. Her shoulder was killing her. Shrapnel, technically, but you couldn't say that. You couldn't explain the wound. You could only sit there in a waiting room surrounded by people whose injuries were at least visible, at least explainable, at least real in a way that hers could never be publicly acknowledged. A young Marine across from her had a prosthetic leg. A woman 3 chairs down was blind in one eye, the scarring visible like a violent map across half her face. An older veteran sat with both hands trembling, the kind of tremor that came from IED exposure or Agent Orange or too many names on walls that shouldn't exist. They were all legible. Their sacrifices were written on their bodies in ways the world could read. Sarah had watched them, and they'd watched her, a thin woman in jeans and a sweater, no visible wounds, no scars they could see. She wasn't one of them. She looked like she belonged in the receptionist's chair, not the waiting room. And maybe that's why she'd noticed the tax forms. There was a clipboard on the side table, someone's intake paperwork they'd left behind. She shouldn't have looked. She absolutely shouldn't have looked. But her eyes had caught the hospital letterhead, and then the numbers, and then the name of something called the Gold Star Educational Foundation, a fund designed to support children of fallen service members. Michael's fund. The one that should have paid for his first year of college because his father had died in Marja 6 years ago, because Navy Commander James Chen had bled out in a location that didn't officially exist, because his name had been carefully removed from every public record except his death certificate. The math was wrong. The totals didn't match the sum of their parts. The Gold Star Educational Foundation had received $847,000 in donations over the past 4 years, but only $312,000 had gone to actual students. The rest had dispersed into administrative costs and consulting fees and overhead to a company called Caldwell Strategic Education Services, which was registered to Principal Vernon Caldwell's personal address in Del March. Sarah had photocopied the forms right there in the waiting room. Her hands had been steady. Her voice had been steady when she'd asked the receptionist for duplicates. But inside, something had cracked. The humiliation of sitting in a waiting room as a patient, of being invisible to everyone around her, of watching other veterans get to be visible and acknowledged and real, it had driven her to do something she'd been trained never to do: surface. Ask questions. Make noise. She'd submitted a formal inquiry about the scholarship fund 3 days before Michael's graduation. She'd been careful. She'd been methodical. She'd used an email address that couldn't be traced back to any classified operation. And Principal Caldwell had responded by manufacturing a trespassing complaint and filing for a restraining order to keep her away from the school before she could ask any more questions. But he'd waited too long. Sarah reached into her jacket, her hand finding the place where she'd sewn the unit patch by hand, stitch by stitch, the night before her deployment to Marja 12 years ago. It was faded now, the Navy SEAL trident worn down by time and sweat and the constant friction of a life lived in the dark. SEAL Team 3. Charlie Platoon. The unit designation that officially did not exist because the operation that followed had been classified so deeply that the government had erased everyone involved. They'd given her a new social security number. They'd paid off her mortgage in a lump sum with a check that came from an agency with no name. They'd told her that if she ever revealed anything about Marja, about the mission, about what she'd done there, they would destroy everything: her pension, her medical benefits, her right to claim she'd ever served. So she'd become someone else. Sarah Chen, the nurse. Just a nurse. Nothing more. Nothing worth noticing. Nothing worth remembering. The patch was all she had left. The one thing she'd kept because it was small enough to hide, old enough to look like meaningless fabric, but real enough to remind her that some part of the person she'd been still existed, still breathed, still mattered even though the world had decided she didn't. She touched it now, through the jacket lining, her fingers finding the faded edges of the trident. And she understood, in that moment, that she'd made a choice when she walked into that auditorium. She'd chosen to show up in her scrubs instead of staying home. She'd chosen to ask questions about Michael's scholarship instead of accepting the silence. She'd chosen to surface, just a little bit, just enough to be visible to someone like Caldwell. And he'd chosen to use that visibility against her. Michael's name echoed from the auditorium again, the ceremony announcer calling for graduates to take photos on the steps. Sarah couldn't see them. But she could picture it. Her son, smiling, pretending he hadn't looked for her in the audience. Pretending he didn't know she'd been removed. The next voice she heard wasn't from the auditorium. It was from her phone, buzzing against the car's center console. A message from an unknown number. 3 words: "Don't come back." Inside the auditorium, the fluorescent lights cast a pale wash across rows of folded chairs and proud families. Principal Caldwell stands at the podium, his smile rehearsed and hollow, as Michael Chen's name echoes through the speakers. In the back row, a Navy SEAL in dress whites rises slowly from his seat. Lieutenant Marcus Wade's face bears the architecture of severe burns, skin grafted and scarred, features rearranged by fire, but his eyes remain unchanged. They lock onto the closing door where Sarah disappeared moments before, and recognition moves through him like current through copper wire. His hands are steady as surgical steel as he whispers one word, Phoenix. 9 other SEALs scattered throughout the auditorium stand simultaneously. Not in unison. Not theatrical. A coordinated rise that moves through them like a wave recognizing its own pull. Fathers and mothers turn. Grandparents pause. The coordinated movement carries weight that transcends the ordinary. On stage, Michael accepts his diploma, confusion flickering across his face as he notices the silent testimony happening behind him. Lauren Chen steps to the microphone in navy dress blues, her dress uniform crisp as fresh linen. She is Michael's older sister, commissioned as an ensign 3 years prior, and her voice carries the precision of someone trained to project authority. She does not smile. My mother, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, couldn't be here because Principal Caldwell had her removed. The auditorium goes perfectly still. Not the stillness of boredom or distraction. The stillness that precedes something irreversible. Caldwell's hand freezes on the podium. His jaw tightens. Lauren holds up a manila file, trembling slightly at the edges. I pulled her service record from the Pentagon database this morning. They gave me access because she's my mother. She unfolds the first page and her voice becomes something harder. 3 Purple Hearts for injury sustained while treating casualties under direct fire. The silence stretches like taffy being pulled. Someone gasps. A mother beside Caldwell leans toward her husband. What did she just say? Lauren continues, her eyes fixed on Caldwell's draining face. All 3 wounds occurred while performing emergency medicine in active combat zones. All 3 times, she returned to duty within 72 hours. She turns the page. There's a recommendation here for a Navy Cross attached to her jacket, dated 2010, Kandahar Province. It was rejected for classification reasons. She looks directly at Caldwell. My mother came straight from a double shift at Oak Creek Memorial to watch her son graduate. She didn't have time to change. You decided that mattered more than her presence. Lieutenant Commander James Harrison stands from the middle section, moving toward the stage with the fluid precision of apex predators crossing open ground. He is Wade's team leader, his frame carved from decades of military training, and his presence seems to compress the air in the auditorium. He takes the microphone from Lauren's trembling hands and his voice carries the weight of command. Senior Chief Chen performed 17 combat rescues in Marja, including dragging for wounded SEALs through a minefield while bleeding from shrapnel wounds sustained in the initial explosion that she survived for 63 minutes before reaching a forward surgical team. He pauses. The auditorium holds its breath. She was recommended for the Navy Cross. Caldwell moves toward the stage exit. One of the parents shifts to block his path, a contractor built like a load-bearing wall. Caldwell freezes. Harrison continues, his voice steady as a laser. Bronze Star. He lets that land. Fathers nod. Mothers whisper. Silver Star. Silence deepens. 2 silver stars. The room tilts slightly. Caldwell's mouth opens. Nothing emerges. And, Harrison says, each syllable deliberate as a countdown, a Navy Cross recommended by 3 separate commands but denied for operational security. The operation she participated in was classified so completely that her military service was erased from standard databases. She was ordered never to surface. To disappear. To become invisible. A man in the 3rd row stands, FBI, badge visible on his belt. Then another. Then a third. They move with unhurried purpose toward the wings where Caldwell stands frozen. Harrison's eyes find Caldwell's across the auditorium and what passes between them is not anger. It is recognition of a particular kind of cowardice. Senior Chief Chen spent 18 months recovering from her wounds in classified facilities, Harrison says. Then she was told her service never happened. She was given a name and a social security number and ordered to live a different life. That's what she did. She became a nurse. She saved lives at Oak Creek Memorial using hands that had held dying soldiers in her arms in the dark. He steps away from the microphone. Some of the soldiers she saved work there now. They recognize her. They know what they owe her. One of the SEALs in the back row drops to his knee. Then another. Then Wade, his burned face catching the light, kneeling in dress whites. The gesture moves through the auditorium like a shock wave. Parents stand. Students stand. The contractors step aside and Caldwell staggers forward, his face the color of old newspaper. The FBI agents place hands on his shoulders, not violent, not angry, just inevitable. Vernon Caldwell, one agent says, her voice carrying the specific cadence of federal authority, we have questions about scholarship fund transfers. We'll need you to come with us. Outside in the parking lot, rain begins to fall. Sarah leans against her car, the rain cold against her face, when her phone buzzes. A text from Lauren, Mom. Come back. You need to come back. Now. She reads it 3 times. The rain hammers the pavement in sheets, and she pushes off from the car, moving toward the auditorium doors. She doesn't know what's waiting. She doesn't know that inside the building, 9 Navy SEALs are standing in formation. She doesn't know that her daughter just announced her rank to 400 people. She doesn't know that Marcus Wade, the SEAL she carried through a minefield 12 years ago, the one she thought didn't survive, is waiting with his hands at his sides, his scarred face pointed toward the doors like a compass finding north. She pushes through the doors. The rain follows her inside, carrying the smell of desert storms and wet concrete. The auditorium goes utterly quiet. Not the polite quiet of a ceremony paused. The quiet of recognition. Of soldiers acknowledging their own. Wade's burned face breaks into something that might be a smile, and he raises his hand, not a salute, something older. Something that carries weight beyond protocol. And Sarah Chen, invisible for 18 years, stops moving. Her hands come up slowly. She meets his eyes. And in that moment, the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the faded symbol of Phoenix Team, the patch that has been her only connection to a life that officially never happened, finally comes home. The auditorium doors opened. 2 FBI agents entered through the side entrance, badges catching the overhead light like coins dropped in shallow water. Boots on polished tile. Their movement was deliberate, unhurried, the way professionals walk when they already know how the story ends. Lieutenant Commander Harrison's voice continued from the microphone, steady as a metronome, reading from the classified file that should never have existed in the hands of civilians. Behind him, the 10 SEALs remained standing, a wall of dress whites that seemed to absorb sound itself. The room held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hum above it all. Dr. Vernon Hargrove's face drained the color of old bone. He stood from his seat in the 3rd row, eyes darting between Harrison, the agents, and the auditorium exits. His hand reached for his phone. His mouth opened. Closed. The practiced authority that had carried him through 18 years of administrative power evaporated like breath on cold glass. He was a man watching his entire architecture collapse in real time, each stone of favoritism and buried accounts tumbling down in front of 300 witnesses. He moved toward the aisle. Fast. Not running, not yet, but the mechanics of a person preparing to run. That's when Marcus Wade stepped into the row. Wade's burn-scarred hands gripped the back of the seat in front of Hargrove. The gesture was casual. Conversational. The kind of movement a friend makes when offering a seat. But Wade's eyes held the weight of 17 combat rescues, of dragging bleeding teammates through minefields, of watching a woman named Phoenix pour her own blood into wounds that weren't hers. Hargrove froze. He looked at Wade's face, at the ruined skin that told a story of fire and survival, and something primal in his body recognized it was in the presence of something that had already been remade by violence and chose mercy anyway. Wade didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence was a locked door. Hargrove pivoted toward the back exit instead, moving faster now, his blazer flapping like a wounded bird. That's when the hospital's IT administrator stepped through the same door Hargrove was rushing toward. Name tag read Martinez. Tattoo on his forearm, Semper Fidelis, faded Marine Corps emblem, the kind of ink earned in sand and sworn in blood. Martinez held up a tablet. The screen glowed with security camera footage captured from 6 different angles. Every moment of Sarah's humiliation played across the display in synchronized grids. Her walking toward her seat. Hargrove intercepting her. His mouth moving. His hand dismissing her like she was a stain on his cufflinks. The security guard's uniform visible as backup. The condescension in every frame distilled into digital evidence, time-stamped and sealed. This one's already on 3 separate servers, Martinez said. His voice had the particular calm of someone who had once carried a rifle and now carried responsibility differently. This one's been forwarded to the district attorney. This one's been logged as evidence with the FBI field office. You want to keep going, or do you want to call a lawyer? Hargrove's hand dropped. His phone clattered to the auditorium floor. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. The 2 FBI agents walked toward him with the professional courtesy of people who had done this before, who would do this again, who understood that the paperwork mattered more than the moment. Hargrove's blazer was so expensive it probably cost more than most people's rent. It wasn't expensive enough to stop handcuffs from clicking around his wrists. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. That was the real telling detail, a man who had built his power on volume, on the ability to command a room through sheer force of will, now moving through his arrest in complete and utter silence. His face had become something carved from ice. His eyes were looking at nothing. They walked him up the aisle past his own staff. Teachers he supervised. Parents of students he'd solicited money from. Secretaries who had typed his emails about fake scholarship requirements. Nurses from Oak Creek Memorial who had come to celebrate their patients' children. None of them looked away. That was what would haunt him. Not the arrest. Not the handcuffs. The fact that no one turned their head, that his humiliation warranted no more attention than a piece of trash being removed from a building. The auditorium doors closed behind him. 6 months later, Dr. Vernon Hargrove stood in the fluorescent purgatory of a strip mall urgent care clinic in Tucson, Arizona. The name tag on his white coat read, Steve. Just Steve. No doctorate. No credentials. No letterhead. He was teaching CPR to a rotating group of bored community college students who needed the certification to work retail, students who didn't know his name, who wouldn't have cared if they did. His teaching license had been revoked. His medical credentials burned. His pension seized by the investigation into the scholarship fund embezzlement, over $800,000 traced through accounts that bore his fingerprints in digital ink. The Navy had found the connections between his fabricated expense reports and the veterans' benefits he'd systematically denied. The IRS had found the offshore accounts. The district attorney had found the trespassing complaint filed against Sarah Chen to be what it actually was, witness intimidation, federal crime, felony stupid. He taught CPR the way a man teaches who knows he'll never be trusted with anything important again. Mechanical. Hollow. Pointing at dummies' chests and saying words about compressions because those were words he was allowed to say now. When patients occasionally called him doctor, he flinched like they'd hit him. The reflex was automatic. Involuntary. The muscle memory of someone watching their identity get erased in real time, which was fitting, given how much time he'd spent trying to erase someone else. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away in Great Lakes Naval Station, Sarah Chen sat in the front row of the bleachers, her dress blues pressed to military precision, every ribbon and medal positioned exactly where it belonged. Her daughter was on one side of her, the same daughter who had announced her rank to a roomful of strangers at a graduation ceremony. Michael was across the parade ground, eyes forward, moving in formation with his recruit division during the final ceremony of basic training. And behind Sarah, standing at perfect attention, were 10 Navy SEALs in their dress uniforms. 10 men who had bled in Marja. 10 men who had watched Phoenix drag them through fire and remembered her call sign like a prayer. 10 men who had driven to Great Lakes to stand witness to her homecoming, to mark the moment when the woman the Pentagon had tried to erase stepped back into the light. The ceremony director called Michael's name. He stepped forward, received his rank, saluted, found his mother's eyes in the crowd and saw her nod, one small movement that meant everything. That meant sacrifice had been seen. That meant the night shifts and the hidden years and the faded patch sewn into a jacket lining had all been building toward this, her son, standing in uniform, walking the same path she had walked, carrying the same title she had carried before the classified operation in Marja that had erased her from official records, had labeled her a security risk, had told her to disappear and never surface. Later that evening, in Sarah's small apartment in San Diego, the faded unit patch was carefully removed from the lining of her jacket. The stitches came out with measured precision. She held the patch up to the light, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, the call sign Phoenix embroidered in letters so faded they were barely visible. She placed it inside a shadow box frame, preserving it the way one preserves evidence. Beside it went the Navy Cross recommendation letter. Beside that, the photograph from the graduation ceremony with 10 SEALs standing at attention, with her daughter in Navy dress blues, with the moment when her hidden identity finally became public record. The shadow box was mounted on her wall where she would see it every morning. Where visitors would ask questions. Where the story would live openly, no longer requiring translation or silence or the slow erasure of self that had marked 18 years of her life. She was scheduled back at Oak Creek Memorial in 3 days. They had offered her the position of Chief of Trauma Services. Director-level authority. Corner office on the administrative floor. Her response had been quiet, measured, delivered with the same composure that had carried her through every humiliation, every firing, every moment when speaking the truth would have destroyed her career. "I'm a nurse," she'd said. "I need to be where patients are." So she returned to the floor in her pressed scrubs, checking vitals and monitoring lines and being present for the moment when someone's world was ending and they needed someone who understood pain, who had held it, had treated it, had survived it. Her colleagues looked at her differently now. The way subordinates look at leaders. But she moved through the hospital with the same quiet efficiency she'd always maintained. The only difference was that now they knew what the efficiency had cost. Now they understood that the woman in scrubs drawing blood or adjusting medications or talking a patient through their fear had once been ordered to disappear and had chosen instead to stay. Martinez, the Marine veteran from IT, crossed her path in the break room one afternoon. He nodded. She nodded back. No words required. Both of them understood the mathematics of erasure and resurrection, of secrets buried and truths exhumed. His tablet sat on the table between them, the same device that had displayed every angle of Hargrove's humiliation, that had saved the evidence no administrator wanted preserved. He'd been commended by the hospital board for his actions. Promoted. But what mattered more was that his code of honor had turned out to be the kind that required bearing witness, the kind that said if someone was being silenced, you preserved the sound of it. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The restraint that comes from knowing you survived 18 years of invisibility and now get to choose what visibility looks like. Sarah ran her hand along the shadow box frame, feeling the texture of decades compressed into a single artifact. The faded unit patch. The medals. The proof that she had been Phoenix Team, that she had saved lives in classified operations that the government had tried to bury, that she had been ordered to disappear and had instead learned to be a healer in scrubs, which turned out to be a more powerful calling than any rank could explain. Scars tell stories. Sometimes the story is written in faded patches and pressed uniforms. Sometimes it's written in the way patients remember you because you treated them like they mattered. Sometimes it's written in the fact that 10 Navy SEALs chose to stand at attention behind you on a parade ground, which is how the world finally learned what you'd always known, that the quietest people in the room often carry the heaviest loads. That heroism doesn't require applause. That sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. So tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? What would you have done if you were Sarah? And if you've got a few minutes, subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button. Comment below with your thoughts. Because stories like this matter. They matter because they're true. Because somewhere right now, someone with a faded unit patch in their jacket pocket is walking into work, doing the job that matters, waiting for the moment when the world finally understands who they've always been.